Okay, so lost in translation, where do we go with this then? Let me try a few preliminary remarks about this topic. And as I've just said to you, Naoko has a project on the idea of philosophy of translation. That might sound very weird because you might think that translation is a straightforward process. We have a statement in one language, we convert it into another. So what on earth could this mean? But it is a topic that's being talked about in increasing ways. And indeed, over the past 2 decades, there's been growing interest in translation, understood not as the study of translation techniques, but in terms of the way that the fact of translation reveals something about the nature of meaning and thought, about judgment, and hence about human experience and the world. Now, most people in this room are listening to or reading a language which is not their first language. And most of you are very used to living between different languages. And when you're living in that way, you're constantly moving backwards and forwards between the languages with which you're most familiar. And that process of movement, as you know better than I do, involves judgments all the time. If the person says this colour is pink, does that fit with this word or with that word in my language? How would I describe it? Even something simple like colour coding, the terms we have in different languages do not match perfectly. So if that's true of something simple like colour coding, or of a word like cup, or mug, or beaker, or glass, how do you translate those? Then think how much more this must be operating, this difficulty, when we're at the level of structures of language, sentence construction, tones of voice, how we address someone, the appropriate register of language for a particular context. So I know, for example, in Japanese there are all sorts of subtleties to do with how you address somebody and the words you use in relation to that person. Those do not exist to the same extent in English. All the way through then, there's an exercise of judgment in which there's no secure rule to show you what you should do. You cannot simply refer to a dictionary or some other measure. It's very unlike the forms of measurement that operate so richly and successfully in science. In Aristotle's terms, it involves an exercise of practical reason, judgment on your feet, with no ultimate rule to guide you. Constant interpretation, constant judgment. And in my view, it's tremendously important for kind of moral education, because these judgments are crucial to how we live with our lives with other people. Okay. So translation then, I think, is not really of any great philosophical interest, and mostly what we're going to be doing is philosophical. It's not of great interest philosophically if it's just taken as a metaphor for human experience. So if someone says, oh, when I left Korea and came to London to study, I felt as though I was translated, you can understand what they mean because it was a kind of big transformation in their life and everything suddenly felt different. That would be using it very much as a metaphor. So that's an appropriate thing to say, but I don't think it's philosophically very interesting. What we're trying to get to is the way that the process of translation, which I just described for most of you that's going on, is actually internal to meaning and to thought. And this would be to make the move that translation is not just something that operates between languages, between Italian and French or whatever it is, but there's a translation, a movement of meaning and association at work in the primary language, the one that you're most familiar with. We'll come back to that later. Does anybody want to ask any comments, any questions or comment? Yes, you do, okay.
If you could explain us more about metonymy.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, thank you very much. I didn't say that. So, yes, I slipped that word in then. It's not so much a metaphor of experience that makes it interesting. It's a metonym. That word's less common, but a metonym is an expression that describes something where a part stands for the whole. So the classic example that's given, a classic example, is that if you refer to New York as the Big Apple, have you heard that? That's a fashionable sort of familiar expression for New York, the Big Apple. It suggests that it's big and lively and rich and fresh, something's happening there. Those are all metaphorical connotations. They used to refer to London as the smoke. Why, do you think?
Foggy.
Yes, that's right. And not just fog, but smoke, or smog as we used to call it as well. There was a lot of pollution here because of industry and coal fires in the past. So it didn't look like this. You had, this time of year, you'd have very thick fog in the streets, very, very unhealthy. Your clothes would get dirty. Now the point is that the fog, the smoke as it was called, was literally a part of London. So to refer to London as the smoke, and going back to the smoke, would mean you're going to London, you're referring to a part for the whole. Get the idea? So the point is with saying that thinking of philosophy in relation to translation has to do with the way that translation, which we experience acutely sometimes between languages, is actually something that runs through our experience. Do you get the point? So the translation is a part of the whole. That's a metonym. Thank you, Sally. Let's go on. So clearly, Derrida is central to what we're talking about today. And the book we're looking at starts off with a phrasing along the following lines: I have but one language, yet that language is not mine. And we'll be puzzling over what that means. I have but one language, yet that language is not mine. Now, of course, the starting point here is that Derrida grew up in Algeria, and he's Jewish, so he's living in a country where most people are Arab, he's Jewish, he's French, or is he? Because at a certain stage in his life, he ceases to be French. He ceases to be French. He's a French citizen from birth. From 1870, all the Jews in Algeria were regarded as French citizens. But in 1940, for reasons you can work out, Jews are no longer count as French citizens. This is the time of Marshal Pétain's collaboration with the Nazis. So Jews are no longer French citizens. And then after the war, he becomes a French citizen again. So that's already quite complicated. And there are complications in his linguistic experience in relation to this as well. But it's not just about people living in those circumstances, which you might think are unusual circumstances. The phrase he's working with is one that he wants to attribute to us more generally. He wants to say this is part of our general relation to language. We think we own language, we think we have a language, English is my language, we say things like that. But actually the relation of the person to the language, of this subjectivity to the language, is more complicated. Am I going too fast in language? No problem? Okay, so how do we approach this difficult topic? Let's look at a first fallacy, a false idea. And the first fallacy is that language is a means of communication. And you say, but surely it's a means of communication. What's the problem? Michael Dummett, who was Professor of Philosophy at Oxford, died fairly recently, very eminent person. He takes language to be a means of communication. You can get modern textbooks that obviously express this same idea as well. And the idea it works with is something like this, that person A has a thought in their head, and they wish to communicate it to person B. So A codes it into words and speaks or writes. B hears or reads the words and decodes. And if all goes well, B then has the same thought as A. So that's a very familiar idea. It's a common sense idea. There's a degree of truth to it, but there are serious problems with it. What is the nature of a thought that A initially has in her mind? Is this not already in language? It's actually very, very hard to find thoughts in your mind that are not language already. And you might think, well, I can picture a painting by Van Gogh's Sunflowers, so I have that in my mind's eye, and I'm not thinking words, I'm thinking yellow or something. But actually you wouldn't have that thought unless there wasn't a surrounding of language that calls it to mind. And as soon as you think of the picture, you think of sunflowers or cornfields or something else, it becomes worded. How many of you know the start of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony? Can you sing it for us? Okay, it doesn't matter if you don't know it, but if you can call a piece of music to mind, then the music isn't in words, is it? Unless it's a song, of course. It's not in words. But you wouldn't be able to do that, and that very experience of music wouldn't be there if you weren't already a linguistic being, if there wasn't a huge background of language to this. Hi, please go in. Yes.
Does it also mean that between language and thought there is always kind of a gap, which means that one cannot always 100% to convey what is in his soul into language totally?
I'm almost going the other way with that and saying that you don't have any thoughts anyway unless you've got this language there already.
But
Okay.
right, sometimes the person himself or herself do not know what is in his mind and her mind.
And sometimes,
And then of course when writing into language.
and some, sure, yes, so we all have the experience that we're struggling to say something and don't know how to phrase it. I quite agree with that, but I think that's an experience of a language being. It's something that comes out of the ability to use language. Okay? Do you get how I do? Now, I don't want to deny that birds in the trees have thoughts, or dogs have thoughts, or whatever. Certainly animals, of certain levels anyway, have thoughts of certain kinds. But they are radically unlike human thought in ways that I'm going to try to show you. Okay, so it's out of this background of language that we have all these thoughts, and including those ones that don't seem to be linguistic. Can you think for a moment of the smell of onions frying? You all smelt that in the street or at home when you've been cooking. Can you think of it? It's actually very hard to hold on to a smell in your mind, to recall the smell. But maybe for an instant you get some sense of that. But you can't do that unless you've got this whole vocabulary going on in the background. Yes, think of the kitchen or the street, the frying pan. All that is there, setting the scene for this momentary sensation, as it were. So language seems to pervade human experience. Okay? Yes. So the thought already seems to be in language. So the idea that it's merely a means of communication seems problematic. In fact, not just in language. You know, we say thoughts are in language. It's not just in language in general, but it's in French or Mandarin or some other particular language. That, in a sense, there's no such thing as language in general. Languages are particular. So it seems then that language cannot be merely a means of communication. Rather, it's more like the origin of our thought. Okay? That's dealt with the first fallacy then. I hope you can follow the argument as it goes. So, language is made up of signs, isn't it? The words I'm now speaking are signs that you're hearing, and those signs take the form of sound waves coming through the ear, hitting your eardrum, and so on. They could be marks on paper. You see marks on the screen here. So they have a certain physical form. They do not function merely as mechanisms, but are open to interpretation and open to new association and connection. So when I'm talking to you, all of you are, I'm sure you're listening to what I'm saying, and you're making certain connections between what I say and certain other thoughts you've had. That prompted your question just now, for example. So that's going on all the time, this process of association and connection, inevitably. And none of you has exactly the same thoughts as another. None of you is having exactly the same thoughts as me because of these different associations and connections. Even my thoughts looking at this now are not like they were earlier on, and they're open to new possibilities. So it does mean, doesn't it, that there's always this possibility of being misunderstood that's inherent in human communication. And that's quite important, as we'll see. And Derrida's way of talking about this, because what I'm presenting to you is very much his point of view, he will say that the sign is unsaturated with meaning. You know what saturation means? If you have a sponge in the shower and you get it full up with water, it can't absorb any more. It's saturated. But the sign is never like that. The sign can always absorb more or take more on, which is why when I say these words, or when I say onions frying or whatever else, there'll be new connotations that come to mind for you. That's very important. And so we get a reaction to this. Then is this just a new chapter in the ongoing story of skepticism, that we can never really know what someone means? And worse, we can never really know what we're doing ourselves. If words are like this, if they're always open to these new associations, if we can always be misunderstood, if they're never tied down and fixed, then is it a new chapter in skepticism? You know what skepticism is? In the philosophical tradition, Descartes says, how do I know there's a world outside me? I could be dreaming now. How do I know there's a table in front of me? Because last night I was dreaming about a table and it wasn't there at all. It was just a dream. So how can I know? How can I know there are people in the room? Because, or that there is anybody else in the world? Because when I dream, there are people. So how do I know you're there? So he goes through that process of doubt, and that's just one chapter in a very long tradition of doubting what we know. It's not just in philosophy, it's a more pervasive feature of the human condition. So here, the critic, the respondent to what I'm saying is, isn't this just skepticism again? Skepticism Mark 3 or 3.9 or whatever it is. And doesn't it leave us with this ridiculous uncertainty? How can we ever know what we're doing? Well, the answer is no. Because what is being described here are simply the conditions in which meaning operates. If it's human meaning we're talking about, it couldn't be otherwise. It's part of the very logic of the sign. These are the conditions in which we are sometimes sure of things and sometimes not. There's plenty of things you're perfectly sure about. You know where you were last night. You know what we're going to do roughly later on today. You know who you're related to. All these things then, you know, that are just part of our world. There's no trouble over this. But there are also the conditions in which we can doubt. Moreover, this non-saturation of the sign, its constant openness to new association connection, is the very means of new thought. It's the very thing that makes it possible for you to say something back to me that I wasn't thinking of and open up a new chapter in the conversation. So it's a very good thing. We wouldn't be what we are if it wasn't for this. The exchange of signs amongst lions, for example, I don't deny that lions think, and they communicate in some kind of way, so they have some kind of repertoire of growls, or roars, or whatever it is lions do. They don't change. They go nowhere from generation to generation. Lions 10,000 years ago were living the same way as lions are now. Whereas, just look around you, how different this was 10,000 years ago. So this openness to new association starts to look as though it's crucial for the way we develop our thought and develop our culture. It's the very means of the exercise of imagination. Because I say a word and you can open it to new possibilities. You almost inevitably do. The operation of the imagination is there, right at the heart of the language. So we might think of it as the engine of culture, the very means of imagination. Imagination is fundamental to language and thought. So signs have a material aspect, as we said earlier on, but they depend also on structural relationships, not just particular incarnations, particular materializations. For example, it could be that this is a special telephone, and it was designed only for this room, and there's no other telephone like that anywhere in the world. It's got special devices useful for working in this room. That would be quite feasible. There's no logical contradiction there. But you couldn't have a word that was available only for a unique usage, one occurrence. Words must be iterable. They must be available to being repeated, used again in different contexts. So how do we need to notice this about words. They also vary in their particular materialization. For example, a word can be spoken or written on paper or written on a screen, but it can also be written in different forms. So that says cat in different forms, different sizes, and even if it was 10 times as big, you could still read it as cat. Get the idea then? So the structural relationship is there because in all of those fonts you can see a certain relationship between the letters, a way in which the A is differentiated from the C. But it doesn't mean that one font has to look the same as another. There's a huge variation, and it could be much greater. The structural relationship then, this is something that comes from de Saussure in early work on linguistics about relationships between signs being crucial. So thought and the circulation of signs Whereas the idea of language as a means of communication assumed that thought was prior to language, we have the thought, then we code it in language, we now have to reverse this. Thought depends upon the public circulation of science. Public circulation meaning out there in the conversations we have, in the words I'm now uttering, and so on. See, that reversal is very profound because it means my thoughts come from out there. It's not the other way around. It doesn't begin in some kind of subjectivity. It begins out there, and this is what enables me to speak. So when Heidegger says language speaks the human being, that's the kind of thing he's getting at. It's from the language that I'm able to be and to think. Not just to think, but to be as a human being. So what's the nature of a word or mark, the kinds of marks that human beings use? The signs that animals make appear to operate in a primarily functional way as mechanisms, let's say, in their instinctive behaviour. So the growl only ever means a growl. It has more or less the same effect. And lines never quote each other. That growl you said yesterday, they can't say things like that. Animals don't do that stuff because they don't have signs that function in that way. So the signs that you human beings use are something more. But why? So let's look at a second fallacy here, and this one we're going to call the self-presence of thought. And if you want the jargon phrases that Derrida uses, it's phonocentrism or logocentrism. Phonocentrism, centering on the voice, the phone, the voice, and logocentrism, centering on logos, which I will explain subsequently. So what could be more immediate than the presence of my thoughts to myself? Don't you feel your thoughts and you have your thoughts, they're there immediately to you. There's no gap, is there? That's as you can be. So what could be more central, this voice is saying? What could be more central, immediate to the presence of my thoughts than the presence of my thoughts to myself? They seem to be as close to me as anything could possibly be. One thing I'm sure of is that I have these thoughts. They are mine. Nothing I'm more confident about being mine than my thoughts. That's partly motivated by a sort of dark Cartesian thought, isn't it? Can you see that? Suppose I had a traumatic accident and I looked down and saw my leg, or and for some reason it wasn't my leg, it was someone else's leg, but I was lying next to someone else and just made the mistake. Then I could be mistaken over that. I could have doubts about that. But I couldn't doubt that it was I having these thoughts. That would be the point of this comment, this criticism in inverted commas from someone else. And the person goes on, Descartes' methodological doubt appears to demonstrate this. Even if I doubt the external world and other minds, I just cannot doubt that these are my thoughts. What could be more real than my thinking, including my doubting? So that's centering thought, centering reason, centering myself in this immediacy, isn't it? But, as we've seen, these thoughts that I have are overwhelmingly in language, in a particular language, English in my case. What are the consequences of this? They cannot just originate in me or be my sole property. I hope you can see I'm trying to just sketch in some of the words that come up in Derrida's text, where he talks so much about property. Property is a very interesting word because in French, you're French? Yes, okay. In French, the connections are more obvious than they are in English, but property, propriety means a kind of correctness of behaviour and appropriateness. Appropriate connects to, and proper can mean in the correct fashion. In French, propre would also mean clean as well. So there's a sense of purity or cleanness going on there as well. That will be threading its way through Derrida's text. And the immediacy of my voice, which is what we've been talking about. Immediacy. In other words, it's not mediated. If you're native English speaker, you learn the word immediate before you learn the word mediate. It's an interesting thing. But mediated means having something else that is going through it, some sort of instrument on the way. But the voice seems to be immediate. It's so close to me. Just as my thoughts are present to myself, so my voice is immediate to me. This reiterates the point. Most fully under my control. As Socrates says, it's unwise to put thoughts into writing, because then you don't know whose hands they will fall into and what those people will do with them. So speech is always to be preferred. And maybe you know that Socrates didn't write. We only know about Socrates really through what Plato wrote, the dialogues he wrote with Socrates speaking. So Socrates is suspicious of writing. And that, in Plato's work, sets up this hierarchy between speech and writing. Speech is prior to writing. It's better than writing. Writing's only what you do if you can't speak to somebody. Speech is superior. So that's very powerfully there in the history of philosophy and thought. Speak to someone if you can, rather than writing to them. Socrates says that written words are like orphan children. They have no parents to protect them or look after them. Who knows what will happen to them? But in fact, in response to what I've just said, in fact, as we've seen, speech is always open to interpretation, to new connections, etc. So the security that Socrates thought was there isn't there. You may be thinking all sorts of things now. You may be thinking things I don't really want you to think. There's no way I can control that. So the uncertainty, the insecurity, if you like, is already there. So writing simply presents these essential conditions of language writ large. Writ large means in big letters, in a very clear way for us all to see. Writing shows the nature of language more clearly than speech does. In this hyperbolic sense, hyperbole is exaggeration. In this exaggerated sense, writing can be said to be prior to speech. When Derrida uses phrases like that, he's obviously not imagining that people started to write before they spoke. Of course, that would be nonsense. But in this hyperbole, with this hyperbolic force, it shows us how the conditions of writing, that openness to interpretation and connection beyond my control, is the very condition of language. The apparent immediacy of speech makes us lose sight of that. So the hyperbole reminds us how much we're dependent in what we say and think, and in who we are, this very notion of the human subject, the human being. We're dependent upon a circulation of signs that exceeds us. Because for me to say to you, onions frying, depends upon something that vastly exceeds me. The way the word onions is used, the way it was used before I was around, before you were around, and the way it will be used after I've died. That word must be available for that wider circulation, otherwise I wouldn't be able to use the word onions, I wouldn't even have the thought onions. You see the sense? It's always there, it's always beyond me. So what we cannot see, what we can see as well, is that the sign can be quoted and repeated. I said to you now, jokingly, that lions don't quote one another, but we do it all the time. We refer back to what someone said. You do it in a court of law, you do it when you're chatting at home about what happened during the day, and we do it in our thoughts by going back to something that was said or thought earlier on. So quoting is actually far more significant than we might have thought. And in fact, it must be available for us, available for this, for it to be a sign at all. A word must be able to be quoted for it to be a sign, a human sign. Human beings can quote blind growls, we can record them and compare them and so on. But animals can't do that. They just use the sign in the immediacy of the action, like a lever to move something. Whereas it's essential to our having words that they're quotable in this way. And I think you even see it in the language of children as they very first acquire language, because they will play with words and use them in unforeseen circumstances. That's typical of the way children acquire language. So the signs I use are not just tools, they don't just exist uniquely, and they couldn't do that, and they exceed my life. So Derrida actually will connect this with the very nature of death as well. So if I say, I have these thoughts, or my relation to my words is as close as anything can be, they're immediate to me, we find that this is destabilized, because these thoughts, so close to me, are in signs that are themselves unsaturated and constantly open to new connections, etc. So, skepticism again, the critic says. You never know what you're doing. How can this make sense? You're saying that we can never really know what we're thinking, even. We never really know. Skepticism mark 4.8 now. Well, no. Because the point is that these are the conditions in which I can have human thoughts at all. In which there can be an I, but this is not the I that can be simply posited as the possessor of thoughts. What it is to have a language, or for a language to be mine, becomes more complicated. So, remember that thought then? I have language. My language is English. What is the I in that? It starts to become much more unsteady. The subject and its relation to the language are so close. And we casually said, I have language, English is my language. But what it is to possess here, or is it my property? Is it proper to say this? All of that becomes weakened or unsteadied. I didn't say this was going to be easy, did I? So one of the terms that Derrida picks up from biology, it's a very unusual term, I certainly didn't know this word, I don't think most people do. One of the words he picks up is the word dehiscence. And in biology, dehiscence refers to the bursting of the seed pod. The seed pod, the pod is the thing that contains the seeds on the tree, and in some forms of dissemination, the seed pod bursts and the seeds are scattered. Can you see how that connects with the idea that a sign functions in this way? The sign, when I say frying onions, it opens all sorts of connotations that I can't control. And of course, I'm not just saying frying onions, I'm saying so many words, thousands of words I've said to you today. And all of them actually have this way of breaking open to new connections. It's a rich image too, because each one of those connections would be a seed, which in turn opens further possibilities without aid. See how far we've come from the idea that language is a means of communication. As though we had our thoughts, knew what we were doing, and could simply calculate ways to come to some sort of conclusion. So I'll pause for a minute. Does anybody want to react? Okay, let's move on. So meaning, presence. We said a lot about meaning. We're going to say something about presence. And don't be too scared off by the nature of being, because I think you'll see how that comes into the picture. So foundationalist philosophers, and thinkers in other fields as well, have sought a secure basis for thought, whether in the mind, which is what Descartes was doing, because he was doubting. You could see, how can I be sure there's a world out there? How do I know there's a table or other people? But I can't doubt that I'm thinking. So that provided him with a foundation for thought, something he knew must be true. And that's referred to as rationalism. And other philosophers have said, no, the obvious starting point is the senses. I touch the computer and I see the light. I've got sense data bombarding me all the time, and that's the basis of my knowledge of the world. It's from that I built up. And Locke even talked about a tabula rasa, as though the mind is like the blackboard. This PowerPoint display mimics the blackboard, ready to have marks written on it. So those are two strong foundationalist traditions of thought, and you find them replicated in various ways. Both are concerned with what is here, present to me now, as the ultimate authentication of the real. Well, how do I know there'll be a tomorrow? How do I know what tomorrow will be like? Well, I get my impression of tomorrow by the fact that there's this and this and this, and then I can also build up from that to yesterday, because yesterday was like this too, and tomorrow is going to be the same. Of course, there may be some disaster, but by and large, that's the way I've moved on to tomorrow, from a thinking of me here now. Logical positivism in the early decades of the 20th century took this to a kind of extreme, and they said things like, Paul here now, as you say it in the first person, of course, Paul here now, as the starting point for my knowledge of the world. From there I go to Paul here tomorrow, or Paul here yesterday, or Paul somewhere else tomorrow, and so on. Okay, so they started to build up from that. That they thought was the foundation of our knowledge of the world, the authentication of the real, the thing we could be sure was real, and on the strength of which other things would be real. Okay, that's logical positivism. I had a dog that was a logical positivist at the time. My dog thought everything was immediate, here, now, me. But, against what I just said, if what we've been saying is right, this cannot be the case. Yes, there is a present, and present works two ways, doesn't it? The present moment and presence in this room. Okay? So yes, there is a present temporally and spatially, but that present can only be on the strength of what is not present. In other words, I know this place here because I know I came from somewhere else, and I know that I know that we're not in some other room or doing something different. That's how I differentiate this space. So, other philosophers, that present can only be on the strength of what is not present, and that applies in time as well, because you can only make sense of this moment that's before us right now in the sense that you know you've come from doing something, and you're anticipating doing something later on, and you're going towards a PhD or whatever it is. So those memories and anticipations coming from and going towards are crucial to our very notion of the present. They're kind of folded back into this present. So we need to think of time not just in the linear sequence of the chronology, like a railway line stretched out, the time of our watches, but also in this other sense in which it folds back into a present. So other philosophers, Heidegger for example, has said things very much along those lines. But this is now apparent in terms of the functioning of the sign itself. There seems to be a non-presence that's internal to being, and that sounds rather ghostly. Let's pause there a little bit then. For me to use the words frying onions, then they wouldn't make sense if there weren't histories of usage of those words in the past, and practices to go with them, of course, out of which I've come into being and come to be able to talk about certain things, to use certain words. I depend upon usages that exceed me, that come from pasts I cannot know. But of course the word onions didn't always exist. It connects with other European words and then comes with other connotations in the past as well. So it all comes from a darkness, if you like, that I cannot know or contain, that I could never exhaustively discover. Furthermore, the word onions could take on new connotations that I'm unaware of. Take the word mouse. Well, there's one in front of me. Well, there was one in my house yesterday as well. On the floor. So words have ways of opening to new possibilities and usage, but beyond what we can know, they're unsaturated, so they always work in virtue of something that's not present there now, not part of them. Always in virtue of this openness to something more. But if that's the case, and if my thoughts are to a large extent made up of words, then I too depend upon a kind of non-presence, a negativity that's at the heart of my being. Why ghostly? Well, of course, he's not talking about ghosts in any kind of sci-fi sense or a spooky sense from horror films or anything like that. But he's trying to defeat the way that we so often think of things purely in terms of what we know, see, touch, and operate with, things that are physically present to us. He's trying to show that that world that we know is only possible because of these things that are not present to us in this way. Right, ghosts and spectres, a little bit more. This opens the way to a recognition of dimensions of human experience, including memory and projection into the future. We all know we're going on to something new, we don't know quite what that is. As again, and again, internal to our experience here and now. So you can't have the experience of now except in virtue of something that's not having been our being on the way to something, our using words, the origins of which we don't know, our speaking in words, the connotations of which we cannot contain. And I'm trying to show you that's not a problem, it's the very basis of our imagination and culture. We couldn't have those things if it wasn't for these structures of non-saturation. But the implications are wider. This opens onto such matters as promising. Do lions promise to one another? I mean, what on earth could that mean? A promise can only work in virtue of something that's not present now, that I will do something or I will not do something. Testimony. You can't testify to the presence of a computer in this room. We can all see it's here, we know it's here. But you can give me testimony about the fact there was a bad accident in the Tottenham Court Road this morning, or something like that. You can tell me about something I haven't directly experienced. And in much of our lives, we're dependent upon the testimony of others, on what they say to us. Sometimes over fairly simple things, like when a teacher tells students stuff they don't know about another time or about a scientific experiment, then the teacher, the children are depending upon what the teacher says to them, his testimony, her testimony. But sometimes, of course, it's crucial in a course of law or in relationships with someone that we depend upon someone speaking truthfully to us, and we trust them. Trust doesn't work with what is immediately present. It depends upon structures that exceeds this. Profession. We've got that endless sociological literature of what profession means, on the nature of professionalism and so on. What Derrida finds in it is the root which connects it with faith, as in confess, for example, or profess, okay. Faith. And that root would suggest that someone who's in a profession is committed to something that's to come, something that's never going to be fully realised, standards that you're always striving for, but you can't simply nail, you can't simply repeat and fix once and for all. So it's kind of honouring something we can't fully make present. And of course, Derrida wants those religious connotations, the profession of faith. And finally, gift giving, which he has much to say about, as many other philosophers have done. And maybe you're familiar with this idea, but the notion of a gift is actually a very complicated one, because in cultures here, what you'll often find at Christmas is that people buy each other Christmas presents, of course, but they very carefully calculate what they buy for someone else. So, you know, if you know Auntie Mary's going to give you a box of chocolates at Christmas, you can't buy her a car. Because, you know, that would really be very embarrassing for her. It would be up as not playing the game properly. So if you've got a matching of gifts, then it looks more like an exchange, and it doesn't look like giving at all. Does it? I mean, it's giving out in a certain sense, of course, but I mean, it's quite a nice thing to do, there's no problem. And of course there are inequalities. You can give a 3-year-old things that they can't possibly return to you and so on. So you might think of other kinds of giving to charity. Well, yes, fine, give some money to charity, and you don't expect any return, so it looks like it's a genuine one-way gift, but you feel better for doing it, don't you?
Yeah.
Doesn't it ease your conscience a bit? So we've got a return once again. Do you see that? And if you go through all the occasions where you might think of giving, you'll find that the pure gift is never quite going to be realised. It's always going to be compromised or contaminated in some way. He likes the word contamination. But he's not being cynical about it. He's not saying, you thought you were giving, but really you weren't. That was just an exchange. Look how pleased you are with yourself. He's not being cynical. He's showing the very structure of the relationship and the impossibility of the gift in any pure sense, but it's an impossibility which we must always strive for or orient ourselves towards. And that notion of the impossible as something that we should be committed to comes back again in his work for reasons I've just tried to illustrate. So this suggests, it rehabilitates, it gives a new home to, that means, rehabilitates, you shouldn't have suggests there, it rehabilitates the idea that there's a necessary spectrality about human beings and the world, a necessary spectrality, a necessary ghostliness about human beings and the world.
So if you think of our modern age, then we look back at the fear of ghosts and all that stuff from the past as a lot of nonsense. At least that's a very common view. It's just people were stupid then, or people didn't know any better. But what this thought suggests is that maybe in that kind of simple or primitive way, there was a kind of truth to that, a truth to the idea of the spectral, which modern naturalistic ways of thinking, if you like scientific ways of thinking, has squeezed out. And that's one of the reasons religion has a bad time today in some circles, that people can't think in those terms because it won't accord with the ways of thinking that science quite strongly imposes on us. This is not to criticise science otherwise. I mean, science is wonderful, Derrida's not against science, we need science and it should advance in lots of ways. But it's it is a criticism of the encroachments of a certain kind of scientific thinking or technological thinking on our thought as a whole. The encroachments, the way that kind of thinking goes into other areas of thought. So we need to maintain something else, a thought of negativity, a thought of what is not present, a thought of the spectral. A spectre is a ghost, I hope you know that. Yes. A spectre is another word for ghost. So the non-saturated nature of the sign means that it epitomizes, that means characterizes very, very distinctively, it epitomizes this non-presence, the spectral, the ghostly, at the heart of our experience. So, I'm sorry I'm going a little bit over time, but language and translation, a third fallacy. Translation involves the matching, this is another voice, you see the inverted commas. Translation involves the matching of a word from language A with a word from language B, ideally to realise the same meaning. And that takes us back really to where we started from in my brief remarks about translation then. So what's wrong with this is first that it imagines languages A and B as more or less pure or uncontaminated. Each is fully functioning, a fully functioning, stable system that must be brought into line with the other. Now, Derrida is writing and working in French, and in France they have had, you can tell me if I'm wrong about this, the Académie Française, does it still exist or not? Okay, so I have a hunch that its role has changed slightly, but I believe in the past it legislated about what was correct French. I don't know if that exists in China, does it? Do you have anything like that? Okay, most countries don't have this. Of course there are grammar books and so on, but there is no body that has the authority to say, this is correct, that's not. And yet, of course, it's something you can't do. It's something that, language has its own life. It will develop in its own ways. You cannot hold it back, at least not fully hold it back. So, what's being questioned then is whether a language can be pure and uncontaminated. Why? Because languages, that one can translate from a pure language to another language, but languages divide up the world differently, as we saw with the colour examples at the beginning and so much else. And no language is pure and stable in the way envisaged. So you've constantly got an invasion of English terms, mostly American English terms, into other languages, or American English into UK English, of course, too. And indeed, the traffic goes the other way sometimes as well, as you realise. And all languages raise problems to do with correctness and propriety, and who decides this? And that thought is very central to what he's concerned with. Who's to decide what's correct and why? I mean, you've experienced how it happens. It's people who have power or a certain status or a certain class. And of course, the teacher is a crucial figure in this. Think of your experience when you were in primary school or secondary school, perhaps. So who decides this, if this is possible? Because in the end, you cannot fully contain language, as I said. So obviously, this raises questions about the relations between language and power, which Derrida will come back to, even the suggestion that language is a kind of origin of colonialization. It's spelled wrongly, I'm sorry. An origin of colonialization. Because if you think about, well, let's give two examples. in France, before the revolution in 1789, there was a far greater diversity of languages and dialects than there is now. In Japan, before, would it be before the Meiji Restoration, or before that even? The language, I think before the Meiji Restoration in 1868, then language was much more diverse, much more regional, and there was a systematic policy of stabilising a new form of written language and unifying the way people spoke. There can be very good reasons for these things, but there are also losses, and inevitably there's an operation of power which effectively colonialises some and consolidates the position of others. So language doesn't just seem to be a means of colonialisation, it seems almost to be part of the origin of colonialisation. I think that's the end. Yeah, so it's a bit longer than I intended, I'm sorry about that, but does anybody want to say anything briefly before we have a break? Does it make any sense to you, or does it seem a bit crazy? I know some of you don't have a philosophical background, quite a lot of people here do, so maybe some of the terms I'm using seem a bit strange, or the way of thinking, so please feel free to talk if you want to. Yeah.
Can you say more about that language? No language is pure.
Yes.
Sorry, because I can wait so.
Well, I think you could do this two ways. You could think of the ways in which Arabic is importing terms from English, and I'm sure from other African languages, from Mediterranean languages as well. And then you can think that it's never actually stable. It's always changing, it's always moving on. You can think about the fact that if you tried to define the key features of Arabic, you'd have some difficulty because there are variants in different countries. And who's to say which is the most central? There are, as soon as you start saying this is the central thing, there's an element of power operating in that. Is a judgment's being made, and that judgment could be very crucial. Of course, we need to make judgments over all sorts of things, but the point is to draw attention to the fact there's nothing definitive or purely natural about what constitutes a language. Does that do it sufficiently? Sorry?
I tried to make link together with what you said about the functioning of science with the spectral, with like present is with non-present and internal to being, and the human experience, and then you included it as the human experience, including memory and projecting.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking like when you say like no language is pure, maybe in a like David confessed, like in his mind he's projecting something really pure language, and he's struggling. So in this way, could we assume this is a pure language in our projecting, and like within this hope that we're kind of struggling?
So you're referring to what he says later in the book, I think, in saying that, and that's very complicated. So in the book, there's a strong autobiographical element in it, as I said to you, as the back cover tells you. And of course, his distinctive experience with language is very interesting. And he feels very, very drawn to French in a certain way. Once feeling it's not his, and it is his. And of course, he writes. And the way he writes is, I suppose you'd say, very literary. It's not just a kind of problem-solving approach to philosophy. It's a very rich linguistic approach to philosophy. And it's crucially important to me how he uses these phrases. And he sometimes loves a phrase. So he'll take a phrase which in French has got different inflections according to where you put the emphasis, for example. And he'll be fascinated by that instability of the phrase and the different connotations it has. You can do the same in Korean and in another language, I'm sure. So he's constantly drawn to language. He's constantly trying to find better ways to say things. And it's like reaching for something, call it the pure language if you like, but you know you're never going to get there. And so he's both trying to improve or refine his French, but also knowing there's something inherently wrong or problematic with
So
that
the
prospect.
origin of this struggling is from his projecting of this pure language, isn't it? Like I'm not saying pure languages existing in the world, but I'm saying like he's projecting about pure language, that's the original, which is struggling to find the better one, find the better expression.
Yes, I don't like I'm sorry. I don't really like to use the word he's trying to find a pure language because he's so wary of notions of purity in every sense, in fact. He's so wary of this. Even pure drinking water, I mean, is pure, he doesn't say this, but is pure drinking water such a good thing? Because if you have more and more pure drinking water, it makes you much more sensitive to all the other things going to be around anyway. So it's not as simple as it might seem at first sight. But he's wary of notions of purity, but obviously he wants to improve or say things better. That's what he's always struggling to do. So in that sense, it's a dedication to something that you feel is better, that could be better, could be improved. But of course, there's no fantasy that there ever could be a Platonic form of French or a pure language without contamination. He doesn't think that. You know that, don't you? Okay. But the future orientation that to write is to testify. It is to try to speak the world, to write the world, to say something about the world as you most fully experience it or believe it. And in our ordinary conversations, something like that is going on. Of course, we have trivial conversations. Do you want milk in your coffee or not? We have trivial conversations, but so much of what we're doing is doing more than just passing on information. The words we say bring something new into the world. Sorry. The words we say bring something new into the world, and it's a further contribution to this world. The world is not just stuff like material things. The world is the conversations, the ways of speaking and thinking that we share, that have come down to us through the centuries, and that we are committed to and owe to the future as well. So it's very future-oriented in that sense. Anybody else? Yes, go on.
Sorry, no, it's a basic question, but can we bring back to the second question about the second fallacy, the presence of soul?
Yes.
And I just wonder, when you quote about onion, it can just opens to the new connotations and the new meanings. And how could you explain when we define like an onion as like a biological existence or something, like we just put the onion into the cage of the language, and by writing a paper or something, we just put the concept of the onion into the one language. How do you explain? Does it still open to new connotations?
Yes, okay. So if I've understood you, when we find an onion, we've never seen an onion before, and we discover this thing growing, then our relation to that is very different from an animal. The animal might eat it, we might eat it, but the animal just will smell it and eat it and try and find another one maybe, but remember the smell. But for us, we see it's an onion and it looks a bit like a potato, but it grows a bit differently, its structure is different. We start to differentiate it from other things that are around. That's the way that horticulture and biology and so on operate, isn't it? So in a sense, with those classifications, you are fixing it, and that's what taxonomies do, don't they? They try to set things out in order. But those taxonomies are extremely valuable in sciences like zoology and botany and so on. We need those taxonomies, but I don't think they ever become completely stable. How many kinds of giraffe are there? Well, there are debates about it. I think the current estimate is 7. And I didn't know this, but the point is that those who construct taxonomies, biologists, aren't clear about what defines a species or a type. So that it still is open to question. And there may be new ways of classifying things. If you go back to 200 years, then physics was understood in terms of certain notions, which now have been radically rethought by Einstein and subsequent physics. Chemistry was understood just in terms of the elements and structural relationships between atoms and so on. But now it's understood in much more complex terms. So I think that those forms of science themselves are open to this new kind of usage, to the new models, new ways of conceiving relationships between things. Does that answer what you're saying?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Anna Maria?
Yeah, I would like, if I can
to add something to this point because I was thinking also exactly.
Yes.
I think that we cannot separate this. If I perceive I see an onion,
Yes.
I cannot separate this concept from the culture where I am in.
Yes.
And the language, okay, I see the onion, I never have seen, but I cannot separate from my environment.
Yes, I agree.
And I think it's very, very important. My perception connected with the culture and the context where I am now,
Yes.
which is connected with the third point,
Yeah.
I think.
Okay,
I don't know
yes.
about the present and what I'm now, and
Yes,
because I
sure.
think it can change.
Yes. So the pig, or whatever animal it is that finds the onion, just eats it
Yeah.
and maybe retains the smell and finds another one.
And,
But as you say, it's always culturally conditioned in some way.
and
It comes.
also, it's not only that. Of course, I have my classes of reading. I'm not in this field, but I come from neurophenomenology perspective,
Yes.
as you know. But if I compare my perception to the commonality, what's happening in my brain when I perceive an onion, this is another point. Biologically, what's happening in my body, and how I translate in words my sensation,
Yes. Yes.
which is also cultural.
Yes. Okay. Yes.
I don't know if.
Well, I think that's right. But what I would be inclined to say is that the sensation you have isn't something that's prior to the culture.
Of course. But
So, you know, the taste of...
I cannot define the sensation without culture.
Yes, exactly. So you're on my side?
Yes.
Okay. Right.
Yeah, but I want to add the culture because in
Yes,
all
of
this
course.
speech we are not state. We
Yes,
are not.
that's right. So if you just take the word onion, then you are familiar with different cooking styles. So your sense of what an onion is, how it tastes, will be conditioned by associations with, for example, soy sauce or olive oil or various other things, modes of cooking, connections other foods we put with it.
And
So-
also the way of perceiving is related with culture.
Yes, exactly.
It's
Yeah.
strongly. This point is connected with translation.
Certainly.
And we have the article about that.
Sure.
So we,
Yes, that's certainly true. Thank you.
Can I add to what they just mentioned? I think that when you go to different cultures and into the grocery stores in different cultures, you sometimes come across with some things which you have never seen.
Yes.
But it turns out that this is specified, it's categorized. It is categorized as a species of onion. So I think that what you call some things, as if you whether you call something onion, is kind of determined by
Sure. Yes, the classifications are different.
classifications
Yes,
with whose criteria is determined by each culture.
yes.
So
Yes.
maybe that's
absolutely. Yeah.
Anybody else? So I think we should have a break then. So can I suggest this is 15 minutes? Is that all right? And then we'll trim the reading session a little bit.